Hello, my name's Hazel Kenyon, and I'm here today from Nielsen Book to talk to you about the book market. So first of all, I wanted to just introduce Nielsen Book. So Nielsen itself is a large company operating worldwide, performing measurement in both online and fast-moving consumer goods spaces, so measuring chocolate bars and toilet rolls. Well, there is a very small slither of Nielsen that operates in the book trade, and that's us. So just to explain a little bit about Nielsen Book, we operate in the book industry with various touch points at all stages of a book's life cycle. So first of all, we host the UK ISBN agency. I just wanted to talk about ISBNs for a moment because I'll mention it throughout this talk. And for those of you that don't know, an ISBN is a 13-digit unique identifier particular to every single book. And this is important because every different format of a book or every different edition of a book has its own ISBN. So when we talk about our bestseller charts and we talk about particular sales, it's by ISBN. And then once you've got that, once you've got the book with its ISBN and the metadata is out there and the book is being purchased, then the research part, which is where I come in, is where we measure the sales of the book, the consumer purchasing the book, and understand really what the appetite for those books are. So in the research department, as well as having those print book sales data from all of the till points, and we collect sales data from online shops such as Amazon, bricks and mortar such as the High Street Waterstones, WH Smith, all the way through to garden centres and little independent shops and museum shops. We also collect physical audiobook sales in the same way. We also collect library borrowings, which operates in much the same way, but we're counting a loan, and we get that data from public libraries and the different library authorities. And that's a useful one because certainly for the children's book market, it enables us to really get to understand the appetite for books amongst the end user, where when you consider book purchasing, there's often a gatekeeper between a child and actually getting hold of that book because they need to persuade somebody to buy it for them. We have ebook sales tracking data, and we collect that from publishers themselves. That forms a syndicated panel, allowing us to perform a market measure. And then we also have the consumer data. So with the consumer data, we've got our long-term ongoing consumer tracker, which we've been collecting data for since 2012 up until current date. And we collect that monthly. And each month we ask 8,500 nationally representative sample, have they bought a book? And then from that, we take 3,000 book buyers. And then we ask them about their book purchase. What format did they buy? Where did they buy it from? But also, and interestingly, why they bought it and how they first discovered it and why did they buy it and did they buy it for a gift and who was it for? So that allows us to have a very rich benchmark of data, which is used throughout the industry. In addition to this, we perform a number of specific looks into market segments. So every year we run a children's deep dive. And I mention that because I'll be referring to the data in this presentation. So rather than saying, okay, you bought a children's book, our starting sample is, okay, you're a child or you're a parent, and trying to understand how book buying and book consumption works within the overall leisure activities for children. So are they on screens? Are they reading books? Or are they, God forbid, outside playing with their friends? So those are the data sources that I'll be using today. So now let's get on to having a look at the children's book market and the state it's in. Well, the answer is it's in a very good state. As you can see for this chart that I've got value sales spanning over the last 20 years from 2001 up to 2019. So these are the value sales for these different genres, and we've actually coloured it so you can see the varying segments of the market. So when you consider that in 2019, we were looking at a market that was worth 385 million, compared with in 2001, the market was worth 193. It's been a significant growth. And that goes from a market that in 2001 overall was worth 1.3 billion. And in 2019, the book market overall was worth 1.7 billion. So looking at children's fiction, first of all, in the green, you can see there's been a number of highs and lows. In 2007, there was a big peak in that children's fiction, and that would have been driven by Harry Potter. And then in 2016, you also saw a bit of a kick up. Again, Cursed Child came out that year, giving that impact to the market. So you can see the effect that a big phenomenal bestseller can have to the children's market. But generally, we saw an up level in the sales of children's fiction books in 2015 to 16, and that's sort of remained steady. So there's been a real step up compared with the sort of previous years. It's also worth pointing out when we look at this is when the recession hit, sort of 2008, 2009, there was certainly a levelling or a dropping off of the overall book market in those years. And it was much more marked in the overall book market. So adult purchasing was impacted a lot more. And in fact, it was adult fiction that was impacted the most greatly. And actually, that was also tying in with when ebooks were starting to come into play as well, and that cannibalizing sales of print books in adult. But anyway, back to children's. The point I wanted to make was that actually it's a fairly robust market compared when you look at it within a recession, wasn't impacted too heavily. So we can also look at young adult fiction in the red. And so we can see really big years in 2009, 2010, and that was very much driven by the Twilight series that boosted those sales. And then we had Hunger Games a few years later. But generally, that's still a small portion of the market. There's been a bit of a drop off in sales of young adult fiction for a few years. Looking at the success story, though, that is the children's preschool and picture books in the light blue, which is just above the green. And you can just see that actually that has really more than doubled since 2001. And so how have things changed? So as I said, we've seen a bit of a shift in this long-term children's book purchasing, but really it's come from all of the different categories. So if we look at 2001, the market share of those different segments compared with 2019, we see that children's fiction has actually contracted slightly, but actually it's worth more now as the market is bigger. But really that market share has grown in Y1, preschool and picture books. And that category has gone from 46 million to 133 million. So we can see that actually as well that non-fiction has actually got a slightly smaller market share, but that again is a market that's grown and it's doubled to 52 million now, and that's been consistently growing, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more, a few more slides. So has the buyer changed? Looking at who is purchasing these books. Well, I've got the male to female purchasing balance there, and you can see that 2/3 of all purchases of children's books are made by females. And this has been growing since 2016. An area we've seen drop off is purchasing by males of between 25 and 44. And we do see a 4% increase in book purchases being made by purchasers without any qualifications. And we also see an increase in the number of books being purchased by people with a household income at the very highest levels. So actually, really what we're saying there is we're seeing sort of a broadening of the purchase. So it's not so concentrated in sort of the higher qualifications or sort of the mid-range income brackets, but it's sort of growing into spaces that it wasn't before. So now let's look at that preschool and picture books category segment of the market. So first of all, what I've done is put together the best-selling children's books for younger children across the last 20 years. And so, again, I wanted to just mention that I've done this by ISBN. So these are single editions of these books. And when you consider that for children's books in particular, you may have multiple editions of a book. If we look at The Very Hungry Caterpillar, for example, it could be the board book, but there'll also be a paperback book, a buggy book, a bath book. And so what I've got here is just a single ISBN. So that would be the case for all of these books. We're having multiple formats. So if we were to combine all of those, that may shift this picture around slightly, but overall, this is what we're looking at. So the first thing to notice is you may spot a recurring author and illustrator combination here. Julia Donaldson and Axel Scheffler hold 6 out of 10 of these best-selling slots. Which is obviously a testament to a huge success. The most recently published of these would be Stickman in 2009. And her dominance, so looking back when our charts first started in actually 1998, at that point she had 3 ISBNs with the best-selling edition there, or best-selling title for her then, was A Squash and a Squeeze. And when you consider in 2019, there are now over 800 individual ISBNs attributed to Julia Donaldson. Obviously, she also has a number of illustrators other than Axel Scheffler working with her, such as Lydia Monks and Dave Roberts. But just looking at just her titles, including some of her educational Oxford Reading Tree titles, there's over 800 different editions. But really, when we look at her growth over the years, it was really in 2006, well, just after Gruffalo's Child was published, that her popularity really started to soar. However, it's also worth pointing out the non-Julia Donaldson and Axel Scheffler titles. And what's interesting to note is the date of publication of some of these. And of course, the children's market has always been very heavily influenced by backlist. Lots of brand new little readers being produced every year. And we see that a lot of parents wishing to purchase books for their children that they read when they were children, that nostalgia element. So if we look at something like Dear Zoo, the first time that was published was in 1982. We're Going on a Bear Hunt, 1989. And if we look at these books, they are very much evergreen titles. And that's the label we give to books that have appeared in every single one of our best-selling charts since records began. So I just wanted to talk about how susceptible the young children's book market can be to trends. So I picked one here, which is probably something you've all seen amongst many different products out there, but certainly for books, are unicorns. So what I've got here is a graph, and I've coloured it by the different segments, but really that just shows you the growth in volume sales per year of books with the word unicorn in the title. And overall, you can see 503 ISBNs, many of them dominated by the purple category, which is novelty and activity. So a lot of colouring books and sticker books, but overall 1.2 million books sold. And if we just look at some of the titles contributing to that, you can see a range of books, fiction, colouring. We can see Peppa Pig in there. And actually what's interesting is also seeing that 30% of sales in 2019 came from newly published titles. So it really is a market or a theme that there is appetite for amongst the consumers. We also keep a close eye on dragons, dinosaurs, mermaids, and other types of monsters. And you can see that Peppa here is, I think, combined together with a mermaid, a unicorn and a dragon. So kind of ticking all boxes there. So moving now on to children's fiction. So those slightly older books where children are starting to read for themselves. And so we've seen an incredible boost in children's fiction, and say not just the bigger authors, but in the longer tail as well. But I wanted to talk about those best-selling children's fiction authors that we saw in 2001 compared with 2019 and what the similarities are. So if we look at the best-selling authors for 2001, the chart is topped by J.K. Rowling, who you will all know, Jacqueline Wilson, Roger Hargreaves, some real big names in the children's book world there. And for those of you that may not necessarily know who some of these are, I've just put some of their titles up here, not necessarily their top title for the year, but so you can see you've got Philip Pullman with his Northern Lights series, Lucy Daniels with the Dolphin series. So some big names there that we all recognise. If we look then and see how that translates into 2019, I've highlighted in the colour orange those authors that remain still selling well. No surprises to see J.K. Rowling there, Roald Dahl, Enid Blyton and Philip Pullman. And obviously for Philip Pullman now, if I just bring up the titles, he's had a bit of a resurgence in sales due to the new titles Book of Dust series that he's now released. We can see David Walliams and Jeff Kinney topping the charts in 2019, and Liz Bichon, really some huge growths to popularity. And these books and these authors are continuing to sell extremely well. And if we just look at some of those books that are doing well, just to see what trends we see, one of them leaps out, and that is very much graphical fiction for children's books. Obviously, children always love illustration, but often it's seen as a difficult transition to go from a picture book through to a completely text-heavy children's fiction book. And these titles here in these series have really sort of broken that up. And I certainly notice it for my reluctant reader, my son, who has struggled to go to very text-heavy books, having these books to break that up. So we look at Diary of a Wimpy Kid. You can see the page here, very comic strip. The Dogman books, a lot of them re-released in colour, proving to be really popular. And then the Tom Gates from Liz Pichon, again, very graphical, very illustration heavy, and these sell really well. The other element to point out in these books is the humorous element. And this is a really big tick box for consumers at this age. And we see this being popular amongst books for children of all ages, but particularly for sort of that middle age, sort of 5 to 10. And if we look at our consumer data and we ask children and parents of children what their favourite genres are, we've got the genres liked for between 5 and 10s in 2019, ordered by popularity. And funny stories is far and away the most popular theme to have in the book you're reading, along with classic stories, fairy tales. And I just also kept on there, although these are fiction genres, looking at the bottom, joke books as well continue to be popular. And if we look at just growth, a number of these top areas are growing in their popularity when children say what they like to read about. And then if we broaden this out to look at the top genres preferred by all age ranges, you can see, because now we're looking at all age ranges, making them laugh has dropped slightly, but adventure, exciting, characters that they can relate to, make them think differently. So these are some of the top attributes that children look for in books that they're reading. So moving on to look at who's buying that children's fiction. So now the male to female purchasing split has balanced somewhat, whereas we saw 66% of all children's books are purchased by female buyers. Now 58% of all children's fiction is purchased by female buyers. So you can see that more men relatively to the overall market are starting to purchase children's fiction books. And that's generally more women buy books for younger children. We also see that the age range between 35 and 44, the number of buyers in that age range are dropping slightly. And we see that, a more significant book drop than for overall books that they're purchasing. And we see the age range that's actually growing in terms of purchasing are for those between the ages of 13 to 24. So that's where we're starting to see that self-purchase of children's fiction, children purchasing for themselves, and that's growing as well. Also, if we look at the data, we can see the reasons for that purchase amongst those buyers, and we see an increase in the number of times that children are asking for those books. So the recipient requested that particular book, and that has grown from 18 up to 23% of all purchases. So a slight shifting in that demographic of purchasers. And actually, we also see a growth in the consumers saying that the recipient liked the author as well. So the author being very, very important with these purchasing. So now moving on to non-fiction. And so first of all, I just wanted to talk about non-fiction because when I showed the growth in the non-fiction, it's actually very much been driven by a particular type of non-fiction. So within our within the books you see, there are lots of leisure non-fiction, for want of a better descriptor, which is branded, which is your game tie-ins, your Minecraft, your Pokemon, books that have a theme, and those branded books have a sort of very variable effect on the non-fiction book market. So a number of years ago, there was a Minecraft book that sold incredibly well, and that made a real difference to that market. But when we look at the overall children's non-fiction, it's more the general non-fiction, the information books for children, that are the ones that are driving the growth in this market. So it's worth just pointing out that over the years, we've actually seen a decrease in the number of, or the share of that non-fiction market that's coming from brands. And if we look at the type of brands we've considered here, You can see Star Wars, and we've just got the top brands here: National Geographic, Harry Potter, Pokemon. So these are the sort of brands driving that non-fiction market, and we're starting to see that decrease. And actually, if we look at the categories, underlying categories of the topic books that are selling well, these are the largest areas. So we've got sort of more traditional subjects that are still continue to do well: history, wildlife, science and technology. These books continue to have a large share of sales of non-fiction books. But what we're also seeing is a really big growth in books such as personal and social issues, books about themselves, understanding the world around them at a very personal level, books discussing anxiety, confidence, bullying, and very much mirroring what we're seeing in the adult book world, where we see a lot of these mindfulness and self-help books, obviously doing particularly well at this point in time. But more generally, there's been an acceptance for people to discuss and read about these books, and perhaps feel open to be able to purchase them. And the same for children. I suppose if you see a parent or you're grown up reading a book, allowing them to understand about themselves, you then may think that's okay for me to do as well. Also worth pointing out, poetry being a large chunk of this market as well. And we've seen an increase in both adult and children's poetry, being an alternative self-help type of calming text to be able to read in these troubling times. And if we look at some of the top titles in these main categories, history, we see Fantastically Great Women and the very graphical politics book, and the Shackleton's Journey, very highly illustrated. These highly illustrated books have done very well, and you can see the sort of types of covers driving history. And then if we look at these personal social issues, You Are Awesome from Matthew Syed doing incredibly well. You've Got This. So lots of really positive messaging coming through. People and Places, again, understanding about the world beyond yourself and beyond your little bubble. History and Wildlife. What we see there is some very topical issues and current affairs coming through, and that's the case for all of these categories. But if you look there, you can see a number of books talking about waste, plastic in the oceans, environmental themes that are very much at the forefront of all of our minds, but particularly for children. And then science, actually probably a little bit more mainstream for the science books. Lots of books on space, continues to do well, but also you can see the waste book sitting there as well, as this book crosses over a couple of categories. And then if we look at bestsellers, I wanted to look at some of the top bestsellers in this area. And first of all, just looking globally, because you often think about how books are doing in the UK market, but actually, do children have similar appetites globally? So if we look at some of the bestsellers, and this was a couple of years ago, but looking, for example, at David Walliams' The World's Worst Children. And if we look at this title, we can see that it's performed very well in the UK and Ireland, but also starting to sell well in New Zealand. And I think that looking at 2019, that pie chart will have grown. Then we look at a book such as an author such as Andy Griffiths with his Treehouse Stories, an Australian author doing incredibly well in Australia, but actually starting now to sell well in other territories and coming through to the UK. And that's a good, strong series that has done well, and will no doubt continue to go from strength to strength in the British market. And again, very graphical in terms of its layout. Wimpy Kid, you can really see the truly international nature of Jeff Kinney's stories, selling incredibly well in many different territories the world over, international popularity. And then it's interesting to look at the two books next to it, which are, if you don't speak Italian, the Goodnight stories for rebel girls. And so the dark blue is the first book and the light blue is the second book. And you can see how well that these Italian authors have done well in these different territories such as Spain, and also Mexico. And then finally, it's worth pointing out some things are very local, such as this particular YouTube star here, social media star, very much just selling in Brazil. And you do have certain leakage across the borders. In this case, just staying firmly within Brazil, but there are many cases where you do have crossovers. And so looking at bestseller charts in the UK, what does it take to make a bestseller? And do children's books actually ever hit that that stage? So what I wanted to do is just look at the number of books you need to sell in a particular week to hit the overall #1. So I've just drawn the 52 weeks across the bottom. This is the sales profile for the #1 book each week. So you can see it sort of picks up at Christmas. Now let's look at the children's overall #1. And you can see that there are a number of points throughout the year where the children's book was also the overall #1 book. But let's just get rid of that peak. For those of you who aren't aware, pinch of nom, huge phenomenon in the book world. Let's just move that out a bit just so we can see in a bit more detail. And when we start to identify those best-selling books, we can see that David Walliams hitting sort of 70-odd thousand books in a week. And the pinch of nom was a particular phenomenon and is not typical, but we can certainly see that sales can hit that for particular books. Again, we've got a couple more David Walliams hitting throughout the year. But as we approach Christmas, we're starting to see more children's bestsellers be the overall #1. The Philip Pullman second in the series for Book of Dust, another David Walliams, a Jeff Kinney, really indicating the popularity of these books as we approach Christmas, as they are necessarily a really great gift to buy children. So it's worth pointing out that children's books play a hugely important part in the overall book market. And so looking forward, just to round out, what do we expect to see in the coming in the coming 12 months? Well, obviously, we're in unpredictable times at the moment. But what we really see is continuing to see books about mindfulness, books about understanding yourself, giving you confidence. We've got a book here about hacks to boost your self-esteem, really giving you confidence. There's a poetry book there for every autumn day. Again, beautifully, highly illustrated, but that poetry being a very sort of calming book. You can see the highly illustrated book about the 50 states. And again, really graphical, highly illustrated. And that's driven by both parents buying these books for children and also children liking this graphical nature of the books. We also see more current affairs, topical books for children. We've seen an increase in the number of books about environment, children wanting to understand what's happening to their planet. Obviously, Greta Thunberg is a particularly popular selling book, and that's really risen the profile of some of the issues that we face. But we've got a lovely book coming out here called Wild Cities, which is about the animals that live in cities and how, with lockdowns globally, the animals are starting to come over and take over these cities. So that's a really topical, very educational title, which you can see is beautifully put together. Acceptance and understanding of people around the world. So books about beliefs, understanding amazing women from the Middle East, just raising the profile of different cultures and different segments of society. We also see for books like that a real crossover into fiction now. Obviously, children love to read stories. So there's a really lovely series, A Glass House of Stars, coming from Usborne, which is a fiction series, but about immigration and immigrants. We can see a vegan cookery book coming from a child here. So veganism continues to be a really popular subject, which again crosses over from both mind and body and spirit and looking after yourself, but also caring about the planet and that plant-based diet. Again, very much a mirroring of what we see in the adult book world. And again, we've got a book here, Bringing Up Race, again, looking at that topical issue. So this is actually a book for adults, but it's about how you talk to your children and how you bring up a child in a culture where racism exists. And so again, not necessarily for the child itself, but thinking about how that parent can have that conversation with the child, because the child is getting that information anyway. How do you have that discussion? Looking at, again, important titles such as Stuart Lawrence writing about the death of his brother, again, a book for children. And then also moving on to the continuation, really, of expert celebrity authors. So we've got Joe Wicks here, who's going to be publishing books for children, activity books for children, obviously off the back of his incredibly successful PE with Joe. So being able to kind of get children moving. Olaf Falafel, who is a comedian, is going to be a comedian and illustrator who's going to be writing a series of books with his co-author on creative, how you can use your creativity to write books, and how to unleash your creativity. And then also Neil Armstrong has got a series of books out for children, who you don't get more expert than that, I suppose. And so just to summarise, the UK book market continues to go from strength to strength, and that growth really is coming from a number of different areas, with incredibly strong and varied content continuing to be produced by the publishers and illustrators and authors in the UK. There continues to be an appetite for books, and some of the themes that children like are humour, adventure, understanding the world around them, really have an appetite across many subjects. And we certainly as well see that in non-fiction, with children becoming, there being a real broadening in the number of topics they're interested in. Children's titles can often hit the bestsellers and really drive growth in the book market overall. And really just a continuing interest in important and topical subjects that we see, which again we see in the adult market. So I hope that's given you a good overview of the children's book market. My email address is on this final slide. Please feel free to contact me, and thank you very much for your time.